ahead and show my screen here. I have a little bit of a cluster already configured here. So this is all on-premise currently. So I have a single vhost with 2 Windows nodes that have an instance virtualized, a named instance virtualized. And as you can see here in my cluster right now, I have 2 Windows servers and 2 Red Hat 8 servers. So just kind of to run through these steps, I was going to demonstrate how easy it is to deploy one of the HA instances. So I need to just create a new virtual host. And what a virtual host is it's a name IP combination that ends up being a logical container for the application and everything else under the vhost. So this becomes, once defined in DNS, this becomes your connection to always connect to the active node for the instance. So I'm going to call this just vhost2. I'm going to give it IP address, and then I'm going to add those 2 Red Hat nodes. So now we have the simplest form of a vhost, and wherever the 10.2.292, that's the IP address we assign to it, wherever the vhost is active, you will see that that IP is bound to that node. The next thing we need to do is just add some storage, and I've already have some storage configured here. So we will, and this is just adding a disk to the disk group, and there's a volume created on that disk. And once you add a disk to the disk group for the vhost, that disk will always follow wherever that disk is, or wherever the vhost is active. The disk will also be online. And then we can go ahead and add a SQL instance. And because this is Linux, it's going to be a default instance. And you can supply a custom port. And then I'm going to give it a data path that's on that shared volume. And we'll just call this DX data. And we'll call this DX log. And then I need to give it authentication so that it can actually connect to the instance and make the modifications that it needs. For this case, I'm just using the SA login. And then I hit OK. And it will go ahead and start the virtualization of that instance. And up here in the process pane, we can actually watch that work. And what it does when you add the instance is it takes the primary node, so in this case DH2i, it takes all of the SQL data and copies it to the mount point that we specified. And then that becomes your cluster set of data. So whenever the vhost is active on a node, it loads the cluster set of data. But the local installation data is still intact to allow things like upgrades and patching, those kinds of things. So it should just take us another second here. There we go. So now we have this MS SQL virtualized across these 2 Red Hat nodes. The next thing we have here is I have a couple of Windows nodes sitting in Azure, and these actually haven't been configured at all. So this will kind of show us from scratch. Let's see. So I go to our downloads page, and I select DxEnterprise, and then I want Windows. I'm going to go ahead and get this started on the other node as well. And then now that's done, so we can go ahead and kick off the installation. Okay, so DxEnterprise is installed here now. But in order to create an HA instance across nodes, those nodes need to have the same instance. So if it's a named instance, they need to have the same name and be the same version of SQL Server. And then on Linux, they just need, there's only default on Linux, so they just have to be the same version. They don't have to be the same edition, though. You can mix standard, enterprise, any of the editions. Okay. So now in order to join these Azure nodes to my local cluster, I come into my cluster membership here, and I create what is called an OTPK, or a one-time passkey. And what this one-time passkey does is it allows the nodes, so each node will talk to what's called our matchmaking service, and they find each other with the OTPK, and they authenticate to each other with the OTPK, and then they use NAT hole punching to create a direct connection to each other. So there's none of our servers are in the data path. There's no middleman on this. So if we come back to Azure One, and I can just say join membership, and I'm going to use our NAT match service along with that one-time passkey. And that join was successful. Now do the same thing on the other node. Here we go. So now, if we come back here, we can see that we have those two Azure nodes as members of the cluster. The next thing I need to do here is just activate their licenses. Here we go, now they're activated. So now I'm going to create another vhost using those Azure nodes to create our final replica set for the availability group. Let's call this vhost 3. And in this case, I don't want to assign it an IP address because I didn't actually pay on Azure to have additional IPs. So if in that case, I can just assign this the asterisk and then the loopback address. And the asterisk says, don't try to bind this address. And then the loopback is just an IP that's available on the node always. So I add my two Azure nodes. And then if I go to my storage management and I look at the Azure nodes, I do have one shared disk here. So I need to create a volume on that disk. And then format that disk. We'll call this volume 3. And 64K is the typical recommended for SQL Server. And then I just need to mount that disk, or mount that volume. So I always use mount points. We'll just put it on C mounts volume 3. Oops. And now that we have the storage taken care of, we can add that disk to this disk group. Let's see which one is it. This one here. And now I can add the instance that I have installed on the two Azure nodes to this vhost. And again, I'll give it a custom port. And then authenticate to the instance. And while that's doing that, I have SSMS connected to the vhost 1, and just for the purposes of showing the migration piece of this. So I have these two Windows nodes on site, and they have a database that is one of our production databases. So this is going to just be we'll just call this prod DB. And now, let's see, where are we at with the still processing? There we go, and now it's successful. So now I have 3 HA instances, one on-premise Windows, one on-premise Linux, and one in Azure on Windows. And all of these instances can exist on either member of the vhost. So I can just come in here and I can say start hosting on member. And this MS SQL Server, this default instance on vhost 2 will move from DH2i 03 to DH2i 04. And then if we select it, we know it's up because this query is run against SQL Server. And you can do this on any of the HA instances. I'm going to put this back on the primary just because. There we go. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create an additional vhost, but this is going to be our extended vhost, or the ExVhost. I'm just going to name this vhost 4. And once again, we don't want to assign an IP address to this. And this time our member type is going to be vhosts. So now we can select each of our vhosts, and it's going to add those as the members. And then when we come in here and we say add availability group, so the configuration already has the login and the instances for all of the other vhosts. So everything's already been authenticated. We just need to name the AG and then say, yes, we want to use tunnels. And we want to use tunnels because of the fact that the Azure nodes are not local. They're on a completely different subnet somewhere else on the internet. So we need to create tunnels between all the replicas. And then you can select different availability modes if you want. I can set these to asynchronous or config only if I want. For this purpose, I'm just going to keep them synchronous. And then we go ahead and accept those changes. We can come back to Process Manager and watch it work. And that was successful. So now I have an availability group created between 3 different high available instance vhosts. And now to kind of complete the steps, if I right click on this availability group and I say manage availability databases, that prod DB that I created on my local Windows servers is available to add. So these will start synchronizing here. And there, with just that many mouse clicks, I basically just migrated a Windows database to Linux and to Azure at the same time. Now, as far as the listener is concerned, what I can do is I'm going to create a listener port here under the availability group, and I'm going to put it on port 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now under my vhost here, I'm going to add a tunnel for connecting to that listener. And I'm just going to call this listener. My gateway name is always going to be the active member of the vhost. And I want it to connect over loopback on the listener port, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then when I add an origin row here, this says who accepts connections and where do I route them. So I'm going to say all members of the cluster. Network address, you can set this to a specific subnet. You can set this to specific IP addresses. For this case, I'm going to set it to all zeros, which says it will accept connections from any source IP. And then for my listening port, I'm going to put in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now my tunnel is updated. And now, so my primary for the availability group is sitting on vhost 1. vhost 1 is running on DH2i, which is on-premise, but I can come to this Azure node now, and I can connect to SQL Server using, I'm connecting to the local node, but I'm specifying that origin port number of 23456. And no matter where I connect to, no matter where I connect from, if I specify port 23456, I will always end up at the primary replica for the availability group. Another really important piece of doing the HA instances that then are also members of an availability group is maintenance windows. So let's say that this whole environment needs SQL Server patching. What I can do is I would start at my third replica. So this is the least likely to be selected for automatic failover because it will always go to the second one in the list first. So I could patch this node and then fail the instance over to this node, or I'm sorry, I would patch the inactive and then fail the instance over to this node, then patch the other node, and then just continue my way up the tree until I get to my primary replica. Then I would move my primary replica to a different member of the vhost, and then I can patch that site or that set of instances as well. And the only downtime while doing that is failing vhost 4 from this member to this member. That's your only downtime, and you just patched 6 nodes while still maintaining HA across all the replicas. So vhost 4, the patching went really terribly. Something has to happen to that. You don't want this vhost to fail over anymore. You can actually just right click on this vhost and say freeze virtual host on member. And you'll see the vhost turns purple. And that means no matter what happens to anything under this vhost will not move. It will stay where it currently is. So then that would make sure that you never accidentally end up with an automatic failover to DH2i until you can actually get DH2i fixed or remedied. So we do have a tool that you can use, so update SQL Server, and this will give you an overview of which versions are installed across which nodes. But beyond that, it's really kind of just, connect with SSMS, verify your version, that kind of a thing.
Okay.
And all of these tools, so let's see here. Yeah, all of these tools, you can still use SSMS for everything. Let's see, I still had, so if I come in here, so I'm connected to Azure 1, but I'm on my tunnel listener, which means I'm actually connected to the primary. I can come in here and show the AGS dashboard. And it will work exactly the way that you're used to it working. So you can use SSMS, you can use any of your existing tools. The only thing that you'll have to modify is connection strings, because now you want to make sure that everybody's hitting that tunnel origin. So we have this cluster disk 2. The instance is actually, if we look at it, it's currently running off data files under that mount point for volume 1. If I move this instance over to DH2i, this disk then becomes active on DH2i. And in the case of spanning this AG across Azure and on-premises, the database replication takes care of, you don't have to have shared storage at that point. Database replication then moves all the data for you. Yeah, the HA piece definitely requires some interaction. The AGS piece, the secret sauce is our tunneling. The tunneling allows us to create a TCP connection from anywhere to anywhere. And then we just manage the health monitoring to make sure that the availability group is actually up and accepting connections and the databases are healthy. So that's most of what I had.